Welcome to today's episode of People and Strategy. I'm your host, Mo Fathalbab, President of International Facilitators Organization. People and Strategy is a podcast from the SHRM Executive Network, the premier network of executives in the field of human resources. Each week, we bring you in-depth conversations with the country's top HR executives and thought leaders. For today's conversation, I'm excited to be joined by Kevin Cox, President, LKC Advisory. Welcome, Kevin.
Thanks, Mo. It's good to be with you. How you doing?
Good. How are you?
Things are good here. Having a good day.
Well, great to have you with us. Kevin, I've read your story, but I want you to share with the audience a little bit about your career journey and what brought you to the field of HR.
I found this profession. I didn't even know it existed when I was in graduate school, and decided to turn it into a master's at Michigan State. Had a terrific learning opportunity then. And then I had a chance to work with three great companies. Most of what I've done has been in HR. There have been some times when I've done some things in addition to like strategy and business development and things of that nature. But I got my start at Pepsi. I was there for about 16 years. And I think most of my better habits, I learned when I was at Pepsi. Spent 14 years at American Express. So crossing not only a great brand from one great brand to another, but a different industry to move out of packaged goods and into financial services was a big opportunity for renewal for me. Did that for about 14 years and was the head of HR there in that company. And then I left to join a very troubled GE, General Electric, back in 2019. And I spent 5 years and a few months helping to transform GE and turn it into the three terrific companies that it is today. And the thing that attracted me to HR back then is I'm a guy that would have trouble declaring his major. And I love the fact that HR is always changing. It's very dynamic. No 2 days are the same. And that variety and that challenge is I think what fueled me through most of my career.
I was just in a conversation about Pepsi not long ago, and I actually was struck to find that even 30 years ago, they had a great feedback process, and they were very ahead of their time, so to speak, and that even today, some companies struggle with whether or not to do feedback and whether to do it correctly. Can you tell us about that?
I love that point that you're making. And in fact, I wish, some days going back to the old days is just nostalgia, trying to get the better of you. But I was telling a young, very talented person that I'm mentoring just this week about the importance of feedback. And the story that I told her was, honestly, whatever I might have become or whatever I might have accomplished had more to do with leaders that I worked for who sometimes saw more in me than I saw in myself. And they had the courage and they had the good nature to give me that feedback. And some of it stung. I mean, some of it was really hard to hear, but all of it made me better. And I worry today that the feedback culture in most companies is much more watered down. It's much more safe. And I feel like the growth of better executives is stunted by the fact that we don't have a great relationship with the term feedback. I hope that's one of the things we get back to, but you're right.
And on the topic of feedback, in your article, Less is More, you also talk about feedback being personal and not automated. Can you say a little bit more about that?
The best feedback has to be personal. It can't be generic. It can't be, I think generic is probably the best word, though that might be safer. It's far less interesting and it's far less useful. Back at Pepsi, we used to have a term called camera lens feedback, which meant that if you're going to give somebody feedback, it needed to be something that you have seen or you have witnessed, like a camera would witness someone, as opposed to third-party feedback or sort of, hey, I've heard, Mo, that you're not as timely as you need to be, and I've heard some complaints that you don't show up to meetings as prepared as you need to be. That feedback lands one way. A much better way to say is, hey, Mo, you and I have had 2 meetings over the last 3 months, and I noticed in both cases, you didn't really seem to be prepared for the meeting that we were having. you weren't on time, and you hadn't read the pre-read. You know what I mean? The way you take that feedback in the latter case is more personal, it's more direct, and it's kind of custom for you, versus this sort of generic, the walls are talking kind of feedback, which I think makes people defensive, paranoid, kind of shuts them down. And by the way, for our audience, that's totally fiction. Mo's been very timely and very prepared. So
Thank you. So, Kevin, you've been involved in not one but 10 CEO successions in your career. How did you develop the expertise in the subject, and tell us what you've learned along the way?
Mo, you and I have talked about. I also have this love of flying airplanes, and there's a connection there. I think the answer to your question is experience is a fantastic teacher, whether you're learning to fly a plane or you're learning to do CEO succession. And I would say that, we have an expression in the aviation community: a good pilot is always learning. Like, you are never 100% proficient. There is always something more to learn. And I feel that way about succession as well. The first couple that I was involved in, I'd like to think I did a credible job, a pretty good job. I read, I consulted with people that I knew had done this. But you do get better as you go along. You see mistakes that are going to tend to happen, and you figure out different strategies to avoid making them. You understand the psychology of succession, which is really complicated. And you understand when people get pretty anxious about it or pretty uptight about it, you understand why that is and what you can do to take a little bit of the air out of the balloon so that it doesn't have to be a tension convention. So it's mostly been through the experience piece, but it's also part of those 10. Some of them I've been an HR head for. Some of them I've been on the board of directors of companies. So I've been on both sides of the desk, if you will, and you learn things differently, whether you're sort of trying to be the showrunner for succession or whether you're actually trying to be the board responsible ultimately for CEO succession.
So before we dig into the succession piece, I'm curious about your aviation lessons, and do any of them translate to HR, so to speak?
Yeah, I learned to fly late in life, so just like 4 years ago, and it is like most things, it's better to do that when you're younger. If you need to learn another language, learn it when you're younger. So it was tough, and it was tough to learn to do that with a full-time job like I had at GE at the time. But it really did help me understand a few things about myself that I think are translating into HR. One of them is people learn differently. I've learned about myself. I'm a much more visual learner. Like, if you show me someone's name on a piece of paper, I'll probably remember that forever. If you just tell me that name, I probably won't. Problem with aviation is a lot of your instruction comes through your headphone by the instructor that's sitting beside you. So it's a very auditory learning experience. So one, I think I learned to appreciate different ways of learning, and you need to adjust as a leader, I think, to be able to do that. Another one I learned that I thought was really useful to me is risk management. Now, you might not think about that sort of as an HR professional, but I think maybe you should. Boards of directors are often the ultimate risk managers. They're there to make sure that the company's growth strategies are safe growth versus kind of dangerous, risky growth. As a pilot, one of the things you're taught to do is manage as much risk as you can by using things like checklists and using things like flow to try to take all of those little mistakes out of play to create the space in your mind to deal with something really challenging, like losing your engine or traffic in the pattern that you might have conflict with or something like that. So I think I've learned to appreciate risk management more and to anticipate risk and kind of look for it. I know a guy who, when he gets in his airplane, even if he's by himself, he says to his airplane, "How are you going to try to kill me today?" Now that sounds grim, but what he's basically doing is putting himself in the mindset of a defensive driver, like, get ready for risk and get your mind right and get very focused on risk so that you can be safer. And people said, gosh, that sounds awful. And I said, well, to me, it sounds empowering. The ability to try to manage and control that risk, which HR people are facing, I think, more risk in organizations today than they did when I started out. So those are just a couple examples.
You also mentioned situational awareness. I'd love you to touch on that a little bit.
There's an expression, how do you know somebody's a pilot? Give them 30 seconds and they'll tell you. So I don't want to wear our audience out with that, but pilots are really big on what they call SA, or as you said, Mo, situational awareness. To sort of have your head on a swivel is another term we use, to sort of always be thinking about 360 degrees and what's going on, to know where you are in space. So that's situational awareness. And I feel like learning to fly sort of retrained my brain that I ought to be thinking about the same thing in HR. I ought to be trying to look at the horizon. I ought to look at things that are here and close to me, but always sort of know where I am in space, or maybe in HR in context. Context is so important to me, I think.
Okay, so on to succession planning and CEO succession specifically, which is an obsession of yours. And I'd love to just hear what led you to become obsessed with that.
I've always put CEOs on impossibly high pedestals. I think this is a weakness of mine. I want them to be superhuman. I accept the fact that they're at the top of the organizational food chain. That sort of there's so much pressure on them, that those jobs are so lonely. Honestly, they're so difficult. They're under so much pressure. So I really want them to be perfect. That is not fair. That's my problem. But I sort of start out believing that, look, you've got the job, so lead us perfectly. This organization is counting on you. So I think my love of, or my obsession, as you said, with the subject starts there. It's such an important job in a company that I study it. And I've had the privilege of working, I think, for actually only like 5 different CEOs over 30 years, which is a smaller number than you might think. And each of them very different than the other. Each of them, they were all great, but each one brought different skills to the party. So I started to think about, how do you replace that when the time comes and somebody decides that they want to retire in the best situation? How do you make sure that you have somebody capable and viable to take the baton from them and not miss a step with the company? And you don't have to read very far in today's papers or your news feeds or wherever you're getting information to see examples where that's not going very well. And I've often said the fastest way you can destroy shareholder value is get CEO succession wrong. You can literally cost your investors and owners billions with a B of dollars if you get that wrong. And to sort of end that on a positive, if you get it right, you can create billions of dollars of shareholder value.
So, Kevin, can you please share a great success story of a CEO transition?
Ken Chenault was the CEO of American Express, I think, for about 16 years. He had spent most of his career at American Express, so he was definitely revered by the organization and thought of very highly by the board. So probably the epitome of tough shoes to fill. And when it became time for Ken to move on to his next chapter, which is unfolding even as we speak, and he's having a great time and doing a great job of it, it became time to think about how do you do this well. And I think that's a story of the board being thoughtful, planful, putting the pressure on Ken and myself to develop credible internal successors. That was Ken's job. Come up with more than one choice internally that you feel like would be viable and able to be the next CEO. And certainly Ken and I were partners in trying to figure that out and develop those executives to give them the best chance to win. And then how do you actually compare that to what you think the challenges of American Express are likely to be in the next 5, let's say, years? So a lot of strategy comes into play in something like that. And just to make sure that you are not only restricting the range to internal candidates, how do you think about external candidates? Because what you really want to pick is the best person in all the land, whether they're internal, which is everybody's preference, or external, which you occasionally do. You just want to make sure that you get an absolute winner and that you've done all the due diligence to come up with the best example you can. And I think it's one of the better examples. In fact, I really don't know of a better one, where the outgoing CEO, in this case, Ken, felt great about the result. I'll never forget the day that they literally handed off to each other Ken's last day of work, and what a proud moment that was for Ken and for Steve, the successor, and for all of us, really. So Ken felt good about it. And secondly, you had Steve Squeary, the successor, an internal candidate, who felt great about it. He felt empowered. He felt in charge. He felt motivated. He felt respectful of Ken's legacy, but eager to kind of build on Ken's legacy for the future. So he felt good about it. And then you had the board of directors that felt great about all of that, as they should. And so to me, if you're a hockey fan, that's the hat trick. You get one of those things, you're doing pretty good. Get two of them, that's a good day. If you get all three, that's probably the ultimate in what you're looking for.
Tell us the ingredients that made that succession so successful.
I think that there's a term that great process leads to great outcomes. You hear that sometimes in HR and in business. I generally think that's true. So a good process, which really is ideally something that's like 5 years from the handover point. You have to start this sooner than most companies want to start it to do it right, to test executives in a couple of different opportunities and roles to get your questions answered. So a good process. I think they started at the right time and they stayed the course with that. Of course, I think there were good candidates internally. I think we also considered external alternatives, because at the end of the day, what you want is the fairest in all the land. You want the very best, whether they come from inside the company, which is generally preferred and ideal, or outside the company, which sometimes needs to be the case. You want to make sure that you got the very best, and there's no doubt about that, and that you could not have done any better. And I think that's the way we try to do it. So those are just a couple of the ingredients that I think made the Amex one pretty successful.
All right. And so I'm curious now about a situation that didn't go so well.
Well, as you can imagine, it's the opposite of that. It's a board that is maybe in some denial about, I think in terms of pilot terms, how rapidly the runway is rising to meet you. Like we're going to have to land this plane very, very shortly. We don't have as much time as you think we have. So I think they misgauged the timing of this. I don't think they followed a great process, and that's related. When you get into a little bit of a panic mode, then you scramble and process goes out the window, and you're sort of doing the best you can. So I think you get some drama with that. I really don't care for horse races, and so that is to me defined as a very public. We've got candidate Mo and we got candidate Kevin, and the whole organization knows that they're locked like rams in a National Geographic documentary or somebody. They're going to kind of beat it out and may the best ram win. To me, although that feels Darwinian and good to some people, in my example, Mo and Kevin are both pretty good people. And if Kevin is defeated by Mo, he probably leaves. And so the company loses 50% of the executives in that horse race, because you made it public, because you made it sort of a winner take all, and because pride is the thing, and people are going to deal with that. So in my not so good example, there was a horse race involved that had all of those dynamics. And then most importantly, the biggest mistake that I think that situation exemplified is the board did not spend enough time talking about what the requirements of the next CEO were going to be. Back to context. What are the big questions this company is going to face over the next 5 years? They skipped over that part, and they just wanted to go to, is it Mo or is it Kevin? Like, who do we like the best? Who presents the best? who's best in the boardroom, who's fastest on their feet, that sort of thing. And so I think those are some of the components of a not great outcome. They made their choice. They hired that CEO. That CEO didn't last too much more than a year. And again, in the course of that year, shareholder value was destroyed. And in the course of getting it right and sort of redoing it, more shareholder value was destroyed. And again, I find that a great example of how not to do it.
So a 5-year runway suggests perhaps that companies should always be planning for the CEO succession, because some CEOs, involuntarily are fired because something goes wrong, or God forbid, get shot, like the case of our United Healthcare CEO recently. So how do we plan for that?
Well, I think it's a parallel process. That's a wonderful question. The way I think about it is there's what I call planned succession. That's kind of 5-year, 3-year, 2-year, 1-year touchdown. And then there's, in a parallel, what I would call emergency succession. And I took home with me in my briefcase, I was a more analog guy back then than a digital guy, but I literally had in case of emergency plan of if something were to happen, heaven forbid, someone were to pass away, someone were to quit unexpectedly, that's not a good time to scramble. And I wanted a playbook that would say, if that happened, would we name an interim? Yes, we would. Who would that interim be? It would be this person. Would we use a search firm? Yes, we would. What search firm would we use? The whole idea was to be able to kind of mobilize very quickly. And, I felt it was my job to come up with that, but then review that with the board at least every year, because things change. The willingness of a board member to step out of a board role and be an interim, that might work in 2015, that might not work in 2016. So, but I think you raise a great point that succession, there's a planned variety of it, which is ideal. And then there's sort of a unplanned things happen that is also part of a good comprehensive succession process.
Thank you. That's helpful. Kevin, we have, our audience is obviously HR professionals and CHROs. What is the delineation of the role of the HR professional or CHRO as compared to the role of the board in this process?
I think that question is a really important one to get succession right, Mo. So thanks for bringing that one up. The board, if you're in a company that has a board, whether it's public or privately held, the board is really the group that needs to be responsible for the decision of the next CEO. In most boards that I've either been staffed to or I've sat on myself, will say that the selection of the CEO is the prime directive. It is the board's most important responsibility, the decision of who's going to be the CEO. So I've always been very clear that my job is not to be the king or the queen maker. It's not to be the picker of who it's going to be. That job belongs to the board. It's also not the incumbent CEO, the outgoing CEO's job to do that, although many of them want to do it. And I can understand that. It's got to be the role of the board. The role of HR, to me, I think I might have used the term showrunner, kind of a Hollywood expression, but I felt like my job was to sort of put the tracks down of the process and remind the board, you are here. This is what you just finished, and this is what's coming up next. Let's stay on track. Let's not panic and sort of go off script or come off process. And again, just give the board situational awareness about how they're moving toward it to make a decision. And sometimes, I'm thinking of one example in particular, sometimes I had half the board was saying, what's taking so long? This process is too slow. Let's just pick. And I had the other half the board saying, what is your rush? What is your hurry? We love the incumbent. Why don't they just stay longer? And so part of your job in HR is to try to get the board on one page, one way or the other. We're going to move faster, slower, or we're going to stay the course kind of thing. So that's, I think, what the role of HR is. And by the way, I realize a number of the audience may not be heads of HR. what can be relevant to those of you who are not yet CHROs? You're doing the same thing in critical role staffing. Like there are jobs at a factory. There are jobs in a regional sales district. There are jobs in the finance function. You pick what you're talking about in software engineering. There are jobs that are especially critical to the outcome of the organization. And your job might be to figure out who the right successor is for those jobs, not just to see a job. A lot of the same principles apply. Spend the time on what do we really need, and let's get alignment around that before we jump to the who's the right and best person to take this position. So the same kind of planful thinking and the same kind of strategy, I think, can apply at all parts of the organization.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Thank you, Kevin. Last question. What piece of advice has shaped your work or personal life?
HR is sort of almost a religious pursuit. And I here's what I mean by that. We were taught to believe that what we were doing was more important than any other part of the organization. And we were not obnoxious about that. We were not bragging about that, but we just got up and we sort of put our clothes on every morning to go to work, believing that we are essential to the performance of this company. And that attitude and that mindset and that sense of responsibility, again, reminds me of flying. If it's called a PIC or a pilot in command. If you are the pilot in command of a flight, you are responsible for the safety and the well-being of your passengers, your airplane, and the space around you. It's an awesome responsibility. I really remember feeling that way when I was back at Pepsi. And that attitude or that mindset, again, you can't be arrogant about it, but to sort of believe deep in your heart that what I do really matters, that's the most important gift I was given. And I try to take that same gift with me to American Express and to GE, and even in my current role in some of the advisory work I'm doing, I really try to bring that forward. So that's the one I think I'd like to end on. I got a lot of great advice, but that probably really made the biggest difference to me.
And it's a perfect one for our audience. And that's where we'll end it for this episode of People and Strategy. A huge thanks to Kevin for your valuable insights. You can follow People and Strategy podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Also, podcast reviews have a real impact on a podcast visibility. So if you enjoyed today's episode, leave a review to help others find the show. Finally, you can find all our episodes at our website, shrm.org/podcasts. Thank you for listening and have a wonderful day.
SHRM.